Why is Australia almost empty? Imagine a The Great Artesian Basin is one of the largest underground freshwater reserves in the world. It underlies about a fifth of the continent and makes some cattle grazing possible in the interior. But artesian water is often too salty and too hot for many users, and it doesn't change the fundamental story of the climate. The Outback is not uninhabitable. Indigenous Australians lived across the continent for at least 65,000 years, developing deep knowledge of how to find food and water in this landscape. But for a modern industrial society built around cities, large-scale farming, and dense infrastructure, the interior has resisted settlement in a way few places on Earth have matched. Section 3. The coasts. Why everyone is there. If the interior pushes people away, the coasts pull them in. The southeastern and southwestern corners of Australia receive reliable winter rainfall, mild temperatures, and fertile soils. This is where British settlers established their first permanent colonies in the late 1700s, and where the population has clustered ever since. Sydney sits in a harbour that early settlers immediately recognized as extraordinary, deep, sheltered, surrounded by sandstone cliffs. Melbourne grew on the banks of the Yarra River at the top of Port Phillip Bay. Brisbane developed in the subtropical southeast of Queensland. And Perth, despite being the most isolated major city on Earth, sits in a Mediterranean climate pocket in the far southwest corner, hemmed between the Indian Ocean and a dry interior. What's striking is how geography has essentially funneled Australian settlement into a curved arc around the southeast and south. on Earth. And crucially for our story, they lived everywhere. Not just on the coasts, across the deserts, through the mountains, along the rivers of the interior. They did it not by fighting the land, but by understanding it at a level of depth that modern science is only beginning to appreciate. Knowledge of water sources, seasonal food availability, fire management, and animal behavior was encoded in oral traditions, songlines, and ceremony, passed down across thousands of generations. When European settlement began, it didn't just bring new people. It brought disease, dispossession, and the deliberate destruction of the very systems that had made the interior livable. Within decades, populations that had sustained themselves across vast territories for millennia were decimated and displaced. Today, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians make up about 3.8% of the national population. And while many live in major cities, a higher proportion live in remote and very remote areas than any other group. In many cases, on country their ancestors have never left. So when we say the interior is empty, that's not quite the full picture. It is sparsely populated by modern industrial standards, but it has a human history that stretches back further than almost anywhere else on Earth. The emptiness is recent. The presence is ancient. Section 6. Immigration and the changing coast. Fast forward to the present, and Australia's population geography is still evolving, shaped now not just by the land, but by global migration patterns. Australia has one of the highest rates of overseas-born residents of any country in the world. Roughly 30% of Australians were born outside the country, and almost all of them have settled in the major coastal cities. Sydney and Melbourne in particular have become two of the most ethnically diverse cities in the world. Walk through the suburbs of Western Sydney and you'll hear dozens of languages. The food, the architecture, the street life, it reflects wave after wave of migration from Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa over the past 80 years. For most of its post-colonial history, Australia had a White Australia policy, a set of immigration restrictions designed to limit non-European migration. It was dismantled gradually through the 1960s and early 1970s. What followed was one of the most dramatic demographic transformations of any Western country. Today, China and India are among the top source countries for new migrants. Vietnamese, Lebanese, Greek, Italian, Filipino, and Korean communities have each left deep marks on Australian city life. But here's the geography. All of this diversity is concentrated in a handful of coastal metro areas. The immigration story and the population distribution story are the same story. People come to Australia and they go to the cities, because that's where the opportunity is. And the cities are on the coast, because that's where geography put them. Section 7. Climate change and the future. Any conversation about Australia's geography today has to reckon with climate change. Because for a country already living on the edge of its land's carrying capacity, the stakes are exceptionally high. Australia has always had extreme weather. Droughts, floods, and wildfires are part of the continent's natural rhythm, but the trends are intensifying. The catastrophic bushfire season of 2019 and 2020, which burned more than 46 million acres and killed an estimated 3 billion animals, shocked even Australians accustomed to fire. Scientists linked its severity directly to rising temperatures and longer dry seasons. In the interior, already marginal farming land is becoming more marginal. Water sources are under increasing stress. The Murray-Darling Basin, which drains a vast area of inland southeastern Australia and supports the country's most productive agricultural region, has been at the center of escalating conflicts over water rights for decades. On the coasts, the irony is sharp. The places where Australians have concentrated are also vulnerable in different ways. To sea level rise, to more intense storm surges, to the bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef, which draws billions in tourism dollars each year. And there's a deeper question hanging over all of this. As the climate shifts, could parts of the interior become more or less livable? Could new rainfall patterns open up land that was previously too dry? Or will warming simply push the margins further, concentrating the population even more tightly along shrinking strips of temperate coast? No one knows the answer yet. But Australia, perhaps more than any other developed country, will live or die by its geography in the century ahead. Section 8. The mining interior, riches beneath the emptiness. Here's a paradox at the heart of Australia's story. The interior is largely uninhabited, and yet it is the source of much of the country's wealth. Beneath those red deserts and ancient plateaus lies one of the most mineral-rich geological formations on Earth. Iron ore, coal, gold, lithium, nickel, bauxite. Australia is a top global exporter of all of them. The mining sector alone accounts for roughly 10% of the country's GDP and drives a significant share of its export income. The Pilbara region in Western Australia is the epicenter of this story. It's a vast, scorching, remote plateau in the state's northwest, about the size of France, and it contains some of the largest iron ore deposits ever discovered. Companies like BHP, Rio Tinto, and Fortescue have built entire industrial worlds out here. Purpose-built towns, private railways hundreds of miles long, ports capable of loading tens of millions of tons of ore onto ships bound for China and Japan. And yet almost no one lives there permanently. The dominant model is fly-in, fly-out, or FIFO, as Australians call it. Workers fly from Perth or Brisbane, spend 2 or 3 weeks on site, then fly home. The mines run, the wealth flows, but the population doesn't follow. This is geography shaping economics in a very specific way. The interior is valuable, extraordinarily valuable, but it resists permanent human settlement even when there's money to be made. You can extract resources from a harsh environment far more easily than you can build a functioning society in one. There's also a growing dimension here tied to the energy transition. Lithium, nickel, and rare earth minerals, all critical for electric vehicles and renewable energy storage, are found in abundance in Australia's interior. As the world decarbonizes, demand for these materials is set to surge. Australia sits on a potential windfall, but the people won't move to the mines. The mines will move the wealth to where the people already are. Section 9. Could Australia ever fill the interior? It's a question Australians have debated for over a century. The continent is enormous. The coasts are crowded. The cities are expensive. Should Australia try to populate the interior? The idea of building inland cities is not new. In the early 20th century, there were genuine proposals to develop large settlements in the interior as a matter of national strategy, to defend the continent, to unlock its agricultural potential, to project Australia's presence across its own land. Canberra itself is a product of this thinking. When Federation came in 1901, neither Sydney nor Melbourne would agree to give up the status of national capital to the other. The compromise was to build an entirely new city in the interior, or at least in the cooler Southern Highlands. Today Canberra functions well as a planned capital, but it sits in one of the more temperate parts of the inland, hardly representative of what true outback settlement would look like. Alice Springs is perhaps the clearest real-world example of what an inland Australian town looks like at scale. It sits roughly in the geographic centre of the continent, on the edge of the Macdonnell Ranges. Population around 25,000. It's remote, it's hot, services are expensive, and water is scarce. It functions, but it doesn't grow the way coastal cities do. The honest answer to the question of filling the interior is probably not significantly, and not soon. The barriers are the same ones they've always been: water, heat, distance. The cost of building and maintaining infrastructure in remote areas is staggering. And in a world where people increasingly cluster in cities for economic opportunity, the magnetic pull of the coast only grows stronger. What might change things? Desalination technology at scale. Advances in renewable energy that make off-grid living genuinely viable. Autonomous vehicles and drone logistics that reduce the tyranny of distance. These aren't fantasy, they are being developed. But they would need to overcome barriers that have defeated every previous attempt at inland settlement. For now, the interior remains what it has always been in the modern era: vast, ancient, resource-rich, and almost empty. A continent within a continent, present in the national imagination, absent from the national census. Closing. Australia is a continent of contrasts. Beaches and deserts, rainforests and red dirt, dense coastal cities and an interior that can stretch for 1,000 miles without a single traffic light. It holds some of the oldest human cultures on Earth and some of the world's newest and most diverse cities. It has land enough for 1 billion people and the water and climate to support only a fraction of that. And when you look at where people have chosen to live, or more accurately, where geography has allowed them to live, you see one of the clearest examples anywhere in the world of how the land itself shapes human civilization. The outback isn't empty because Australians turned their backs on it. It's empty because the desert doesn't give easy options, and the coasts aren't crowded by chance. They're crowded because that's where the rain falls, the soil holds, and life is possible at scale. Geography, as always, doesn't decide everything. But in Australia, it decides more than almost anywhere else on Earth. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more geography stories like this one. And let me know in the comments, what other countries have surprising population distributions you'd like us to explore?